Welcome and thank you for joining today's conference, Model Minority Myth. Please note that all lines are muted until the Q&A portion of this call, and I will provide instructions on how to ask a question at that time. With that, I'd like to turn the call over to Will Reichard, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Specialist. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending today's webinar. This is the second of 8 webinars for AAPI Heritage Month. So just a few quick announcements before we jump in. Below you, you'll see a box for closed captioning, and that is provided in the box below where my face should be right now. If you are listening to this as a recording and you require any other specific accommodation, please feel free to email me at william.reichart@usda.gov, and I can assist you. If you have any other technical needs, please feel free to reach out to us in the chat pod, and we can provide that technical assistance. And then lastly, just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded for future use. I would now like to introduce our Assistant Director of Civil Rights and Field Operations, Rick Ballawong, to give us an introduction. Rick, I would invite you now to please turn on your webcam and take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. Hope everyone can hear me. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're at. Thank you for joining us today. And from what I see from the participant list, we have a great participation rate, so thank you. First of all, let me just say, you can't turn on the news now or look at the news and without hearing some sort of crime or assault being perpetrated on an AAPI member. And, that's both heartbreaking and maddening. And the topic we're going to talk about today, model minority myth, in my opinion, it plays no small part in perpetuating the hate against the AAPI community. The reason I say that is when we categorize a group of various cultures, various beautiful cultures, and pigeonhole them into one category, model minority, what you essentially do is dehumanize and depersonalize that group. And it's so much easier to hate a concept or an abstract thought than it is to hate individual people. So for those that are inclined to hate, they're hating a group and not an individual person. The people they're attacking, the people they're perpetrating crimes on, are a concept and not an individual person. There's no more thought in getting deeper into who that person is, whether or not they're someone's mother, grandmother, father, grandfather, brother, sister. They just represent a group, and that's, again, heartbreaking. But it's venues like this that help us educate the masses, and the fact that you're here tells me that you're willing to be educated, and I thank you for that, about, first of all, the myth, model minority, and that's as much a myth as the Tooth Fairy and Loch Ness Monster. So I'm glad that we have Lynn Quat and Sam Wu, who are our presenters today, and going to sort of delve deeper into what perpetuated this myth, the history, and sort of educate us on, how we can get past it and how we can help each other get past it. So with that, before I turn it over, I'm looking forward to this presentation. I want to thank Will Reichart for facilitating these talks, and I also want to thank Berlinda Baca and the DE&I staff for supporting this and other special emphasis programs. Again, welcome. I hope you learn a lot today, and I'm here to learn with you. Let's take this journey together. Will, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome, Rick. As always, thank you for your thoughts, insight, and leadership. I would now like to turn it over to our speakers, Lynn Quat and Sam Wu. Both Lynn and Sam have done an amazing job on this presentation, and I'm really excited to hear this content and engage in this learning journey with y'all. There is some audience participation points, so I would encourage y'all to stay involved in the chat, as well as you will have the opportunity to get involved on the phone line if you wish as well, and we'll prompt y'all later with instructions. With that, it seems like Sam and Lynn are both coming on camera as we kind of transition our space to the presentation space. Sam and Lynn, why don't y'all take it away?
Thanks, Will. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Model Minority Myths webinar. I'm joined here with Sam. My name is Lynn Quat. I currently work for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, USDA. And I formerly worked for the Forest Service for 8 years before that as a soil scientist in Region 2 and 6. So the USDA is somewhere I'm staying for a while, and I was also involved with the Asian Pacific Employee Association, APA-EA, with SAM, so with Executive Committee, and we wanted to put this together for our fellow colleagues to learn about the model minority myth. Sam, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sam Wu. I'm a project manager and a mechanical engineer with the National Technology and Development Program out of San Dimas, California. I've been with the Forest Service now for 14, going on almost 15 years now. And I'm really excited to be here and speak with you all today.
Thanks. So before we start, some ground rules. Like Will said, this webinar will be recorded, and a link will be shared in the future. And all lines are muted except for the presenter phone lines. Please be patient with us because technical difficulties do happen. And if you get disconnected, please jump back on as soon as you can with the link that was provided in the invite. And last but not least, this can be an uncomfortable topic to talk about and hear about, but know that me and Sam, we are just presenting the best research that we can and provide our stories and hear from the rest of the audience about your experiences. Yeah. So that the next slide talks about that being a difficult conversation and uncomfortable topic. But the best way to be part of the solution, best way to make the problem smaller is to be part of the solution. Otherwise, the problem can be very large. Something that I heard in advice from someone recently. So before we start, to kick it off, I kind of wanted to get to know who we have here in the chat and our audience as well as each other. Sam, what's your ethnic heritage and what AAPI figures in the public eye do you look up to?
Well, so I'm Chinese. My mother was born in Taiwan. My father in southern China, but immigrated to Taiwan at an early young age following the Cultural Revolution in China. So it's weird because I think of my family history as being from Taiwan, but in all actuality, I've actually been in the U.S. longer than they were in Taiwan. So they rode opportunities born of the Civil Rights era and immigrated to the U.S. through higher educational opportunities. I actually grew up speaking Mandarin Chinese as my first language at home, and apparently, and I don't remember this, but when I got into preschool, I really couldn't speak English, and so my parents, they freaked out a little bit, and they did a hard stop on speaking Chinese for several years, and pretty much only spoke English for the next couple of years. And so that's kind of my ethnic heritage. To that second question, the AAPI figures in the public eye, I'm a big basketball fan, so my natural answer is Jeremy Lin and the heights that he went up to. But a little closer to home, I have a friend, Andrew Chow, who is a college friend of mine, and I really look up to him now. He's a little bit more in the public eye now. He's the co-founder of the Boba Guys. It's a growing company that specializes in high-quality, Taiwanese influenced drinks. I've just followed his career, and seeing how he was able to weave his business and values-based strategies for company growth with this advocacy for Asian businesses, entertainment, and civic engagement. So what about you, Lynn? What's your ethnic heritage and who do you look up to?
Thanks, Sam. I am Vietnamese American. I am a child of two Vietnamese American immigrants that came here after the Vietnam War in the 1980s, and I think that my heritage is a huge part of my identity. I'm very proud of it. It did take time to get there because I was born here in America, and I did think that to fit in, I needed to look and sound like a white American, but the beauty of America is that we have that diversity, and I'm able to celebrate that now, knowing more about my roots. AAPI figure I look up to is Christine Ha. She won the 2012 Master Chef competition, if anyone's watched that. I am a huge cook, and I love to cook. She is blind and also Vietnamese American, and was able to win the competition very inspiringly, but also being able to celebrate her roots in cooking delicious Vietnamese food while also being disabled is just super inspiring to me. I will hand it off to Will to summarize where everyone's coming from and their answers to this.
There's some awesome engagement in the chat, so thanks a lot, everybody. So we're seeing folks from all over the country, folks from Texas, folks from Utah, folks from the East Coast, West Coast. We're seeing a lot of George Takei, some Yo-Yo Ma, right on. He's actually one of mine. Folks who are saying they admire their mothers, people who are fourth-generation Japanese Americans, folks who identify as Puerto Rican. So there's a lot of diversity in here. So thanks everybody for your participation. Yeah, this is awesome.
Thanks, Will. And thank you everyone for being so active and participating, and continue to do that throughout this presentation, because it will make our webinar so much more fuller with your participation in the chat. So for today's discussion, I wanted to give you a roadmap of what we'll be talking about. First, we will define the model minority and what it means. Then go into depth of the history, where did it come from and how did it develop. And then lastly, how does this impact AAPI today, and how does this affect Asian American Pacific Islander relationships with other racial minority groups? So, the model minority, it refers to minority groups that have seemingly achieved a high level of success in contemporary U.S. society. And this set of stereotypes often portrays Asian American Pacific Islanders as smart, for example, naturally good at math, science, and technology, being of high socioeconomic status, like being healthy and wealthy, hardworking, self-reliant, and living the quote-unquote American dream. So oftentimes the model minority is seen as docile, submissive, obedient, and uncomplaining, and spiritually enlightened and never in need of assistance. So what's so bad about that? We see a picture of beautifully created by Donna Liu. Well, it has a problematic narrative because it creates a monolithic definition of a very diverse group of people. There are over 20 groups of Asian Pacific Islander groups in the category of Asian American Pacific Islander, or AAPI. It just doesn't account for the full range of the needs of the AAPI diaspora. It also overemphasizes the role of cultural norms and behaviors on outcome, which basically means that we are saying the stereotype actually causes people to not have their own individuality outside of that. For example, because I'm Asian American and I have this culture of being hardworking, etc., then that's why I'm successful, rather than saying, hey, Lynn, you are an individual that are hardworking and therefore you have attained success. It also erases a lot of current and historical racism and discrimination against Asians, in which Sam will go through an in-depth history of that in America. And it dismisses the bamboo ceiling that exists and used as a wedge between AAPI and other minority groups. Comparative suffering of Asian American Pacific Islanders versus other minority groups like Black Americans and Native Americans, etc. And it also seesaws between the perpetual foreignness narrative, where being Asian is seen to be foreign, even if you are born here or you immigrated here at early age or you are a naturalized citizen. So that's a lot of the problematic narratives. But I'll hand it over to Sam to go through the history.
Awesome. Thanks, Lynn. So this section is really going to be focused on the origins of the mono-minority myth. How did we get to this conception of Asian Americans as the mono-minority? And as a disclaimer, I'm going to focus a lot of the talk on the Japanese and Chinese American experience, but that isn't to discount the challenges faced by other AAPI ethnicities. We'll see that the origins of the term mono-minority, however, are very much rooted in the unique struggles of the Chinese and the Japanese. A further disclaimer, I'm not a historian, but I am aware that the retelling of events and their historical significance will have some amount of subjectivity. We're attempting to provide accurate data to be a starting point for conversations, rather than for this webinar to be the webinar to end all webinars on this topic. So please use this as a jumping point for more discussion. All right, to understand where the mono-minority myth came from, we need to understand the historical context around Chinese and Japanese experiences. So I'm going to dig way back. And while our context for mono-minority stereotypes and stereotypes of Asian Americans have really been the primary lens for viewing, mono-minority being the primary lens for viewing AAPIs in the last 60 years or so, another stereotype completely dominated the previous 100 years, and that was that of the yellow peril. So this whole section is going to be based on how do we get from here, to here, right? This time cover in the 1980s. I remember that one. I think my parents had that one. So the yellow peril was this idea and fear that there was a coming tide of people from Asian countries that were a threat to the Western world. This wasn't a concept that was just relegated to the U.S. The term yellow peril was coined by a Russian sociologist in 1897, and the concept of the yellow peril was used by Imperial Russia, Imperial Germany, the United Kingdom, and Canada to really push back against Asian immigration into their countries. The term yellow peril really incorporates a lot of the other ideas as well, not only of this threat, but Asian bodies as being dirty, morally corrupt, and subhuman. It blended ideas of Asians damaging the fabric of societies. There was sexual anxieties brought up, and the existential fear that the West was going to be outnumbered by the East. So yellow peril racism was a cause of a lot of the discrimination, stereotypes, and violence against Asian Americans. It's not the whole reason for anti-Asian sentiments. There was economic scarcity in the 19th century and in the 20th century that also formed a basis for a lot of the anti-Asian sentiment, pitting low-wage immigrant groups against each other. So, but some of the impacts from the yellow peril concept and idea are organized resistance against Asians at the time. So there were anti-Asian societies that were created, such as the Asiatic Exclusion League in 1905. It started out, this was already past the Chinese Exclusion Act, so they were focused on the Japanese and the Koreans at that time in 1905, trying to restrict immigration there, and they rebranded themselves to try to incorporate exclusion against even more groups outside of just Japanese and Koreans. And that group, that exclusion, that anti-Asian society that was created, it actually was very influential in pushing forward a lot of the policies that we saw actually instituted within the U.S., both in federal and state laws, state and federal laws. The Yellow Peril racism also manifested in direct violence. During the latter half of the 19th century, there were more than 150 documented group attacks against Chinese communities and settlers throughout North America. One of the most famous or infamous ones was the Rock Springs riot in 1885, city of Rock Springs in Wyoming, where there was rioting against Chinese miners by white immigrant miners. This riot led to over 28 miners dead with $150,000 in property damages. Adjusted for inflation, over $4 million today. Miners were scalped, mutilated, branded, dismembered, burned alive. This was not relegated to one particular incident, and it's not relegated just to Chinese Americans. But we saw lynchings throughout the late 19th century and into the 20th century as well. There were stereotypes that formed out of these racist depictions of the Yellow Peril, so common that even phrases came into being. Having a Chinaman's chance, that means nothing to me now, but at the time, and you can see it throughout popular literature or movies at the time, having a Chinaman's chance meant you had no chance. You had no chance of whatever, doing anything. I am going to move into talking a little bit about some of the historical events and using those historical events to kind of walk us through some of the things that were happening. So Chinese immigration to the U.S., this was the first time that Asian Americans had, or Asians had immigrated to the U.S. in large numbers. And with the gold rush in 1848, we had Chinese laborers that immigrated to the U.S. looking for better economic opportunities following war in China. So working in mining for the gold rush, but then afterwards, and maybe parallel as well, working at with the Transcontinental Railroad, which we've talked quite a bit about within APAEA, the Asian Pacific American Employee Association. There are, I believe we still have webinars and events set up this month to talk about some of those heritage moments for Asian Americans. So originally, that introduction of low-wage laborers was actually seen as a positive. It was something that people were looking forward to be able to bring low-wage immigrants from somewhere else to do the work that other people didn't want to do. But soon, with economic scarcity, you see that it becomes a serious source of friction with other segments of American society, particularly among white immigrants who themselves were often also trying to struggle at that time. Thought that they were the ones that were losing out. And that anti-Chinese sentiment really hardened into some of those organized groups specifically dedicated against the Chinese originally. So the impact of all this anti-Chinese sentiment resulted in the latter part of the 19th century with the Page Act of 1875, which technically barred East Asian prostitutes from entering the U.S., but in practice it really essentially barred any Asian women from entering the U.S. It also resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first and only federal immigration law that prevented immigration and naturalization by race. Around that, I mentioned mob violence. There was a round of mob violence in the late 19th century, emboldened by those fears of Yellow Peril, and you also saw the rising support of anti-Chinese property laws and immigration laws to try to restrict people coming into the U.S. I have here the Treaty of Paris, and the Treaty of Paris was the treaty that ended the Spanish-American War, and it caused the Philippines to become a U.S. territory. So actually, I learned in doing my own research that the Filipinos were actually the first Asians to settle in the U.S. In 1763, there was a Filipino settlement in Louisiana. Now, the Treaty of Paris, however, in 1898 was the inflection point for larger mass migration of Filipinos to the U.S. So with the drying up of Chinese immigration due to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we talked about in 1882, immigration from other Asian countries to the U.S. increased, driven by the demand for continued cheaper labor. And with that increased migration, mostly from Japan, but also from Korea, and then and the Philippines with the territory, with the Philippines as a U.S. territory. With all that increased migration, we also saw anti-Asian migration sentiment expand beyond the Chinese, leading to eventually to the Immigration Act of 1924 that effectively banned all immigration from Asia. That act created quotas. It created quotas for immigration that were tied to the 1890 census. So the 1924 Act linked the census data from 1890 to be able to have a percentage. I believe it was 2% of the 1890 census count, which account that really poorly represented Asians, and overrepresented immigrants from Europe. So with that, it essentially dried up immigration from Asian countries. So I mentioned the alien land laws over there as well in that first column. So alien land laws, it's interesting because over a dozen states from California to Minnesota, let's see. Okay, so alien land laws, so over a dozen states from California to Minnesota crafted laws that used coded language specifically designed to exclude Asian and other immigrants, non-desirable immigrants. So the phrase was aliens ineligible for citizenship. So using a law passed in 1790, I believe, states used language to exclude primarily Chinese and Japanese immigrants from establishing homes and businesses at that time. Now, moving on to, so we talked about the Federal Immigration Act, that was 1924, but moving on to World War II, with World War II, that war reshaped the geopolitical realities and radically affected Asian experiences in the U.S. For Chinese Americans, it was an opportunity in a way. The allyship between the U.S. and China led to the Magna Act in 1943, which was the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act and gave a path towards naturalization. But it did not repeal exclusion acts for other Asian minorities. That particular one, because it was to signal to China to some extent that the U.S. was embracing the Chinese within America. So for Japanese Americans, it's a totally different story. President Franklin Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066, which established internment camps to forcibly remove and incarcerate 120,000 people, most of which were American citizens. It's one of the stains on U.S. history that still resonate today. So after World War II, we see a new shift of realities that now correspond to Cold War geopolitics. I'll go into this a little bit more in another slide, but geopolitics remains a serious factor in how Asian Americans are viewed at this point. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act allowed for naturalization for all other Asians and abolished a lot of the alien land laws. That act also established a preferential system for immigration that placed a special importance on economic potential, special skills, and education. And I'll cover the rest of these points in a different slide. Now, this slide is going to be impossible for most of you to see unless you're teleworking at home with like an 80-inch screen. But basically, this graphic links a lot of the historical events that we covered to immigration patterns as captured in the official U.S. Census. So there are all sorts of caveats to this data, but you'll see the broad interaction between immigration laws and the flux of AAPI ethnic groups. So I'm just going to cover a couple here. Gold Rush, 1848, and if you can't really see it, that first green bar, that's the census for Chinese Americans. Prior to that, I don't believe it was really being covered. So we see the introduction of the Chinese after the Gold Rush. With the introduction of the Chinese Exclusion Act, now we see the immigration of Japanese, Filipino, Korean, and Asian Indian ethnic groups, and that just continues to go on. In 1924, this is a barring of immigration, but now we already have immigrants in America. World War II, 1939, and with the Cold War, we see the introduction, or we see several proxy wars. The Korean War in 1951, I believe, 1950 or 51, and then Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975. And you see the introduction of the Vietnamese in the census in the 1970s. Hawaiian statehood, and you see Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander groups start to become part of the census here after 1959. Just a couple other points that I won't touch on specifically really after the 1960s, but we have 9/11 and obviously last year with COVID-19, some of the big events. I'm bringing up this graphic just to show a little bit about the types of exclusionary laws and the number of exclusionary laws. I went through a bunch of different sources to look and try to categorize and play with the data a little bit in terms of what types of laws were created, whether they were federal or state. And we see over 48 laws that were used as exclusionary laws against Asians, both federally and statewide. And I wanted to draw your attention over here in the bottom half in the graphic. You'll see a couple clumps. These, with the X's, those are property laws I mentioned earlier about the alien land laws. So the first clump is, well, we have some property type of laws earlier, but there's a clump around 1880. So that's after the passage of 1880, after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, you see several states institute alien land laws to restrict Chinese from owning property and setting down roots. Then you see another clump are both right before and right after the passage of the 1924 immigration law, which restricted all Asians from immigrating. And then there was a third clump here, which is actually a little less. We had 3 states, Utah, Wyoming, and Arkansas, which all had Japanese internment camps, and they created those laws to keep the Japanese Americans from staying inside the state. So they tried to create property laws to restrict Japanese Americans from staying. So that's, we could spend a lot of time. Hi, can you still hear me? Yeah, I'm still here. My Adobe Connect froze up on me. So I'm trying to bring that back up. Okay. Give me just a second.
No problem, Sam.
Okay. Is my video feedback?
You're back.
Yep.
Awesome. Excellent. All right. Could you give me control again over the, perfect. Excellent. So I wanted to focus a little bit of our time as we conclude the history part on where the model minority part really starts to click in. So the 1960s is the decade where we start to see a bunch of stuff come together. So in the 1960s, we have the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. The Civil Rights era really assists Asian Americans in incredible ways, lifting a lot of the exclusions and the discrimination, the systemic discrimination against Asian Americans at the time. It's a reshaping of the Asian American experience. Geopolitically, we also see the Cold War-related events in Asia. We see that the Communist Party of China take control of China in 1949. So in the 50s, you have a bunch of stuff that was happening, right, with the reshaping of the alliances between communist nations and democratic nations. And so we see proxy wars in Asia. We see the Korean War in 1950 to 1953, the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. And in the midst of that Vietnam War, we have the 1960s, where we have the real birth and just kind of the rise of the civil rights movement. So in the middle of that, with all these geopolitical things that are happening, there's a lot of uncertainty for Asian American groups. With the Chinese, the Chinese Americans were coming from a place where there were new opportunities that had arisen from the allyship with the U.S. and China, but that turned with the transformation into a communist China. So there was a desire to move from that narrative into something that was more sustainable. And then along with that, we have the Japanese Americans coming out of the experience from the internment camps and concentration camps to try to reintegrate into the U.S. and find a place there. And so we have all those things, and the model minority myth is born out of that. It is both from a push from Asian groups, the Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans themselves, and having a confluence between those experiences and the geopolitical realities and the usefulness of having a successful narrative for Asian Americans, Asians living in America. And so in 1968, we had the first coining of the phrase model minority by William Pedersen. He's a sociologist. He wrote an article in the New York Times that emphasized how family structures and cultural emphasis on hard work really allowed Japanese Americans to overcome discrimination against them and achieve that success and acceptance in the U.S. At the same time, we had the Chinese American spokespersons use two loaded symbols, that of the coolie, the Chinese laborer, and the soldier, Chinese Americans who fought in the war, to really illustrate their distance from that idea of aliens ineligible to citizenship, and show the capacity for assimilation and deservedness of inclusion. So that confluence of Asian Americans struggling for existence plus the geopolitical reasons for pumping up Asian minority success, that kind of plays into the model minority myth that carried on and transformed a lot of different ways that Americans saw Asians, the American society saw Asians. So at the same time, we also have like we mentioned before, the Civil Rights Movement, and there was also a parallel budding Asian American movement. Prior to 1968, Asian American wasn't a thing. It wasn't a concept that people had. It was a self-determined label born out of like student movements, student advocacy movements, to create a label to really indicate a political agenda of equality, anti-racism, anti-imperialism. San Francisco State had a huge strike during that time to create an ethnic studies branch of education that really focused on the Asian American experience. And out of that, we have already like some narratives that push against the model minority concept itself. And so I wanted to kind of finish by talking through how the perceptions have changed. The first initial question was, how did we get from the yellow peril to the model minority? And we see that with the movement from looking at the preceding Chinese laborers as originally as a good thing, that they were termed as celestials in some places, and seeing that perception shift and seen as viewed as dirty and unhygienic, morally corrupt. All Chinese women being viewed as prostitutes. There's resentment of Chinese for depriving white workers of jobs, pushing down wages. Chinatowns were seen as dens of vice with gambling, opium, and prostitution. And perceptions shifted again with the start of World War II, with public opinion largely embracing the Chinese as the quote-unquote good Oriental, with Chinese fighting on the side of the Allies. Then post-war perceptions of Chinese Americans as being distinct from China and having, as the opportunities increase for Chinese Americans, there was a narrative both pushed by Chinese Americans but also by the government for a narrative of family-oriented, success-driven immigrants to push back against some of those older prevailing perceptions of Chinese and secure a place in the U.S. And similar to that, and for the Japanese, we see a similar story, but from a different angle. So we have the perceptions, the yellow peril kind of perceptions that was similar to the Chinese, but you also saw different geopolitical concerns. At first, Japan was seen as an ally nation fighting on the same war, same side of the war with the U.S. in the First World War. Then the shifting perception of the Japanese as the enemy. There's, I mean, we still know now to this day, the phrase a Manchurian candidate. someone that's working on the other side and whatnot. Yeah, that's crazy that this picture is a poster from the Forest Service. Yeah, I pulled it out directly because of that, and it staggered my mind when I saw it. Then shifting perceptions again as the Japanese became the model for racial integration. Japanese Americans pushing hard to be seen as American, as probably best popularized through the 442nd Infantry Regiment, one of the most decorated regiments within World War II. There was a narrative that was pushed then of patriotism, non-threatening perceptions of the Japanese that could be easily assimilated into the U.S. society, and that was both driven by Japanese Americans themselves at times, but also generated through the U.S. concerns about reintegration and not having actually wanting to show that it was easy to reintegrate and actually trying to spread Japanese Americans throughout the country rather than consolidating Japanese Americans in one place. So this is kind of where the model minority concept converges, kind of like a Pincer attack, pushing a narrative of the Japanese and Chinese Americans that were successful, upstanding citizens, morally upright with cultural values focused on family and education, and that narrative and that concept of model minority being extended to all Asian Americans. And I will stop there with what I have to present. And I want to ask Lynn a question, and at the same time, I'm asking everybody else on the chat to put in their responses. So Lynn, with the broad strokes of history behind us, how does your own history intersect with this timeline? How has your family story been affected by the historical context of AAPI in America?
Thanks, Sam. That was a really great history moment and very informative. I am Vietnamese American, so my parents immigrated here after the Vietnam War. So the fall of Saigon happened in April 30th, 1975. So that was 46 years ago, just a couple of weeks ago. And not being Japanese or Chinese in my heritage, but I am looped into the greater group of Asian American Pacific Islander experience. So oftentimes I do get confused by people being of Chinese descent, so forth, and it oftentimes can be challenging to be part of that narrative, but we are, like being Vietnamese American is part of that timeline, and even now there's a lot more history coming up after the war. I feel very grateful that the Civil Rights Movement happened in the 1960s, which then encouraged the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then encouraged the government to relook at all of the laws that were in before and then create the Immigration Act of 1965, which allowed for more immigration for all Asian Americans, which allowed my parents to come here. And then and able to create and rebuild after a very horrendous war in Vietnam. Many, many people in Vietnam were killed. Many of my extended family was killed during the war, and we were able to come here, create our own life here, and I am now working for the NRCS and before that the Forest Service. And it's interesting that you kind of brought that poster up earlier, and it was a Forest Service poster, and I had no idea that, like, a part of this, the history of the Asian American experience, we weren't always included in the history of the USDA. And it's not now until now that we're actually speaking and talking our stories even more that we can say that, hey, in the past, in history, me and you, Sam, we weren't seen as the good guys. We weren't like the people that were the stewards of the land, but we were in some kind of way. So anyways, I wanted to open it up to a chat. Will, what are you seeing there? What are people saying?
Yeah, so there's a lot of good participation again within the chat. Folks saying that they have family members that were in internment camps, other folks talking about home ownership and the fact that family members were not able to own homes in various parts of the country. I think I saw someone specifically talking about SoCal and the LA area just a few chats ago. So I see multiple attendees are kind of typing, and I'll just kind of share a little bit about me while their folks are chatting. I'm a South Korean adoptee. So after the war, when the infrastructure was largely destroyed in Seoul, there was a large amount of orphaned babies just from the war. And as a result, the infrastructure is built for a lot of international adoption, and that's part of the reason why I was adopted and came to America. So I see someone else saying, growing up a few years, folks have been struggling more kind of with that context. Someone in Montana, raised in the 70s church, sponsored Vietnamese refugees, and you kind of gave them context. And first exposure to Vietnamese food, right on. Awesome. Do we want to give folks the option for the phone lines as well, or do we want to stick with the chat?
Sure, we can do phone lines.
Sure. Operator, if we can give folks procedures for phone lines.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press pound 2 on your telephone keypad. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted, and at that time you can state your name and question. Once again, by pressing pound 2, you'll be placed into the question queue.
Thank you so much. Another in the chat said they recalled parents having issues at work with kind of needing to assimilate and being the only Filipino on the team. Yeah. This is some great interaction as well. And if you do want to participate on the phone line, please feel free to do so. We'll give folks a little more time. Awesome. My mom's uncle worked in sugarcane fields in Hawaii. So after 5 years, he was allowed to go to the mainland and meet the U.S. I did not know that was not differentiation there. Thank you for sharing, Ralph.
Sam, do you want to talk about your family?
Sorry, struggling with figuring out where my mute button is. Yeah, I think so. My family immigrated, like I mentioned earlier, post civil rights era and whatnot, and it's easy to draw the through lines of how I was raised and thinking about trying to assimilate as much as possible. Even that little story about like learning English and just really focusing in on English. My Chinese language speaking abilities are pretty poor now. I have an 8-year-old daughter, and her Chinese is better than my Chinese now. So, like by far. It very much is intersecting in the later part of that with the professionals and whatnot coming into the U.S.
Awesome. We're seeing some more folks in-laws joining the U.S. military as an avenue to help with kind of that immigration process. Absolutely. Operator, do we have any folks that are on the phone lines?
We do not have anybody in the queue.
Totally okay. We do have a question real quick. The question is, how is the model minority myth played into perception of our careers at work? I'll leave it up to Sam and Lynn if we want to talk about that now while folks are still kind of typing, or if we want to answer that at the end.
Anne always has good questions. I think that's really depends on the narrative of your own individual experience. For me, the minority myth basically plays into my career of saying that, it causes me to question if my identity is why people see me as successful and maybe more submissive and quiet, and these different stereotypes with model minority, or is it more of like me as an individual? I may be more quiet, but I also happen to be Asian American, so that plays into that model minority stereotype that just solidifies more for my coworkers. So I don't know. What about you guys? Anyone else have anything to say about that?
I think we can maybe circle back to this question as well at the end.
Yeah.
I'm sure we every other people on the line can maybe put their themes in the chat, and maybe we can bring that up later. Will.
Sure. Should we just continue?
Folks, thanks for lighting up the chat. If folks are interested in kind of going back and hitting the comments we didn't see, I'd encourage you to go back. There are a lot of really awesome thoughts from everybody, so thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I wanted to go into more of some statistics that I was really shocked to find in my research about Asian Americans. Asian American college students are actually 1.6 times more likely than all other groups to make a serious suicide attempt. And I looked at some narratives, and that is likely due to the model minority myth that the pressure to do hard work, and often that pressure causes a lot of mental health issues. And Asian Americans are 3 times less likely to seek out professional therapy or counseling. So this causes people in our communities to feel like they're alone and feel that if they do not raise to that model minority threshold, then it is really difficult and becomes to the point where things can get really hard. Another thing is that not all Asian Americans do well in America. I mean, Southeast Asian communities, 35% to 40% of Hmong, Laotian, and Cambodian populations do not finish high school. And did you know that between 2007 and 2010, AAPIs had the highest share of long-term unemployment of any racial group? And in 2020 alone, AAPI had also the highest unemployment group of any racial group, and that may be tied to some associations with COVID-19. And here's like a graphic of all of the different groups and the median household income by the origin of the people. Although Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders on average have relatively high levels of household income in comparison to other groups of people, there is a huge variation in between the household incomes within the ethnic groups within the AAPI. So you can see that the highest are Asian Indian, Filipino, Japanese, Melanesian, and Chinese. But another thing that we need to account for is that AAPI have larger households, about 3.3 per household versus in America it is 2.5, or sorry, white Caucasians are 2.5. AAPIs disproportionately live in metro areas which have higher cost of living. For example, the states of Hawaii, New York, New Jersey, California, and even Washington and Oregon, there are 50% Asian Americans and 58% of Pacific Islanders living in these states, and in comparison to 19% of white Americans. So that basically causes our median household income to increase a lot just because of the cost of living in a certain area. So we see that with saying that all Asians are successful in terms of social economic status, it couldn't be true for some of the other Asian groups. For example, being a Vietnamese American, we're at 58,000, which is way less than, for example, Filipino and Japanese and Chinese. And I also wanted to bring up the additional Asian American Pacific Islander stereotypes. With the model minority, there are also very negative stereotypes that are associated with Asian Americans. For example, the fetishization of Asian women. The recent attacks in Atlanta show that there are a lot of images in American culture where Asian women are seen as very sexually attractive, and that is also linked with the geopolitical war history that Sam has presented previously. And along with that, the emasculation of Asian men not being considered as attractive as other men in other groups. And also just the general xenophobia towards Asian people, where people link Asianness to badness. For example, stealing jobs, traitors, and the virus, for example. And these things, like, we weren't able to cover in detail in this webinar, but there will be future webinars that can cover these topics in more depth with history. So my question to everyone, and to also Sam and Will, it's easy to get lost in the statistics sometimes. What is the takeaway for you from hearing about these impacts on the larger AAPI population? Sam?
So I really didn't know about these statistics prior to this year. I haven't really reflected on the Asian American identity outside, honestly, of the Chinese American identity as much. And so it's caused me to reflect on my the areas where I have privilege even within AAPI communities. And I think one of my takeaways personally is I want to be more intentional about learning about the unique struggles of the AAPI diaspora. You know, so as an example, I have a friend who is Burmese, and I've known him for 20 years. His wife was my wife's bridesmaid, but I didn't know much about his connection with the Burmese community. I was reading about the coup in Myanmar a couple of weeks ago, and I thought about him. I texted him and talked to him and started to learn a little bit more about his story, how he came to America, and the unique challenges that his community faces and faces even now. And that weekend, I ended up going to a rally in Pasadena that was in support of democratic expressions for the Burmese community, and just spent some time hanging out with people and talking and learning about some of the concerns and whatnot. And so that's kind of my takeaway, that I want to personalize some of these statistics and whatnot. Will, do we see anything in the chat box? Or,
we do indeed. We do indeed. And again, thanks, Anne, as always. So we need to continue to dispel the stereotypes about Asian people, men and women, by always speaking truth and showing everyone that we have strengths and weaknesses, challenges, and successes just like every other human being. As always, Anne, mic drop. Thank you very much. Some other comments from other folks just saying thank you for explaining kind of the negative implication of this model minority narrative. And as other folks are typing, I think for me, similar to Sam, just kind of being aware of the API community is not a monolith, and figuring out how I can use my privilege within the community to better serve others, to build up the entire community as a whole. So as someone else said, honoring individuals and their unique stories. For example, we don't get a lot of stories from various communities, and often, again, these stories kind of get all lumped into one monolith. So thank you for that thought as well. Got some other folks typing. Sometimes Asian Americans are not counted as statistics. Yeah. From what I've heard, not a lot of Asian Americans were considered statistically significant, during polling and voting information. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that was a frustration for me as well. Recognizing diversity, absolutely. These are great comments, everybody. Thank you for processing this information and truly engaging with it.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, so I'll continue on. Thank you, everyone, for your input and your answers. So moving on to impact on other communities. So I put here colonial trauma. Basically, colonial trauma being that during basically Asians have immigrated here into the Western Hemisphere, and there has been a division of communities of color caused by that trauma of some of the history, for example, that Sam was talking about from the gold rush to World War II. Our ancestors, which realized that being close proximity to whiteness could aid on our own survival. So kind of survival of the fittest. And what that caused, though, is it caused a wedge between the AAPI community and other Black, Indigenous people of color, and a narrative which has been perpetuated through a lot of different areas, but this misconception has also causes pervasive and damaging building coalitions and solidarity with other Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And also it influences, like I said, Asian American mental health. What my key takeaway from this is that it is really important to stand in solidarity with each other, no matter regardless of your background. And when we compare the struggles of one person to the other, it's like my mom would say always, don't compare an apple with an orange. Like there are struggles of an apple versus an orange if you're farming between both. So we're stronger together, just like Jen said. And so no matter the stereotypes, and specifically minority, it causes us to take away the humanity from an individual who may be part of an Asian American Pacific Islander heritage. So another discussion question is, how does this affect your perception of the AAPI community and other BIPOC communities? Sam?
Yeah, so, I mean, this has just been a really incredible learning experience for myself. I think one of the things that I've been trying to do is really dig deeper, one, internally. Seeing the stories that I grew up with in terms of and the stereotypes that I had growing up with anti-Blackness in a lot of the cultural stereotypes that I grew up with, and trying to learn about the people who have really moved the needle in terms of supporting other minority groups, being able to stand in solidarity. So I've been reading about, listening to voices from people like Yuri Kochiyama, the American civil rights activist, and I think this is where it's really digging into my own personal experience and trying to reshape how I think about things and how I think about people, and look to really support other people of color. Are we seeing much in the chat? And Will, do you have any? Do you have an answer to this? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess for me is I want to be really intentional of how I show up fully in my Asian identity for other BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous people of color, and I'll be very explicit about that. I want to be intentional with how I show up for my African American brothers and sisters in this struggle for civil rights, because again, we all are facing different issues, but the commonality between kind of a lot of is the fact that civil rights is not status quo. And until it is, I think we need to think about strategically how we are partnering and showing up for each other. So for me, that's kind of what my commitment is and what I hope to aspire to. Other folks in the chat are talking about the importance of schools and education and how sometimes we're not taught this information. So making sure that this is kind of being taught in schools. MLK paraphrased it, judge people not by their appearance, but rather the content of their character. Awesome. We had another one. Come on. Yeah, again, more about just kind of education and the importance of education. So, yeah, this is all good conversation, y'all.
Yeah, thanks everyone. So we are going to close it up with some closing questions now that we've presented a lot about the model minority definition, the history, and some of the impacts to our communities as a whole. How have we effectively challenged model minority assumptions, and how can we effectively challenge model minority assumptions? I know there was some good input earlier. I was reading that, I think Anne said, colonial trauma is the elimination of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander narrative from the U.S. history. We need to acknowledge that our Native Hawaiians also deserve the same recognition of their heritage, the same way we are finally recognizing the Native American communities and cultures. So yeah, when we say API, we also are including Pacific Islanders, and because me and Sam are not with that heritage, we couldn't speak for others, but we do want to uplift others to also share their experiences. And there is a lot of people in the Pacific Islander heritage that are also grouped into the model minority assumptions that it does not apply to them. Yeah,
I have one real quick. Yeah, I have one real quick from John. Sorry, John, the chat was lighting up. So John was saying, as a white guy, I see how many of my ethnicity are feeling threatened by the growth of other groups, and kind of just this idea of reinforcement of white supremacy. And John saying John is not saying this for himself as well, but more of just an observation is my interpretation. So John, I just want to make sure we got to your comment. Sorry, Lynn.
No, go ahead. Read more and see if Sam has any answers too, or anyone on the phone too. I realize that most people might be actually on the Adobe Connect platform, but you can also dial in, and that's where you can speak and click #2.
Hey, Will.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rick Ballalong here. Thank you.
Hey, Rick.
Quick question. Thank you, Lynn and Sam, for that educational presentation. Quick question for you, or anyone actually who's listening. Have you experienced or know anybody that experienced any COVID-related discrimination? If you have, and if you could sort of tell us about it and how it played out.
That's a great question, Rick. Thanks. And there was some, again, John talking about terms like Kung Flu, China virus, are steps backwards. And kind of while y'all are thinking, I'll just kind of share a brief story. So I got on the Peace Corps. We were all evac in March of when everything started to close down, and I was quarantining in central Wisconsin. I can remember going to grocery stores, and it was the looks that I got as I was kind of walking through the aisles that said more than words. So it was myself and two other white Peace Corps volunteers, former Peace Corps volunteers that I was with, and I distinctly remember walking down the grocery aisle, and as I was walking down the aisle, people would kind of move away from me. It was like the parting of the sea. And then my two friends would walk right behind me, and they would kind of close back in. And that happened down like 4 different aisles. So that was, there wasn't anything aggressive or overt, but that, in my mind, I correlated it to the perception of my ethnicity. coming into the Forest Service, though, I can remember Apaea did a lot of work around kind of helping to support AAPI folks within the Forest Service. And that's ultimately why I really wanted, that's really kind of sealed me wanting to work for the Forest Service, is just hearing the work that Apaea was doing and just the concern for AAPI folks within the agency. So that's my brief story. Thanks for your question, Mick. And Lynn and Sam, I guess if y'all have any comments on that as well.
There was a presentation that I did with my fellow Apaea EC member with Maggie Luna. We did talk about the COVID-related stuff, not only hate crimes, but also like microaggressions. And I could say that, yes, same thing with what happened to Will in the grocery store. There's more of a feeling of people not wanting to get close to me. And even before the COVID-19, there have been incidents where I've been walking down the street and someone says, like, go back to China and you don't belong here, go hang out with your something biatches, things like that are very hurtful. It might not be a physical attack, but words can hit harder than physical attacks sometimes, or exasperate to that at some point. But there's been so much in the media where people that look like my parents, grandparents, are getting attacked, and it's really sad.
Yeah, a lot of people can put their own experiences in the chat as well. I know for myself, I haven't actually experienced any overt or even actually covert discrimination for myself during this time of COVID. But many of my friends that I regularly speak with, they have. They get the same kind of comments about go back to your country, go back to where you came from. To I'm a part of a Asian American church, and that church they had some of the elderly people that were attacked in LA, and we have friends up in the Bay Area, quite a few friends in the Bay Area that see it, that are closer to a lot of the more recent attacks and whatnot.
Some other folks in the chat saying that family members were told they cannot speak their own language at work. Some other folks talking about discrimination specifically in Florida. I agree. It has been incredibly upsetting with seeing all these blatant attacks, specifically on elders, is what kind of gets me. There was that picture, I think, in San Francisco where there was, my perception was an older Asian woman who beat up her assailant, and it was the assailant that was getting assistance and not her. And granted, that was one picture, but the perception of older AAPI folks, I think, has been exceptionally difficult to watch.
Awesome. So I just wanted to move back to the question of how can we effectively challenge these model minority assumptions and really any of these stereotypes based on being Asian American Pacific Islander. Well, I can say that continue to have conversations like this and educational moments and sharing stories and speaking up. And I especially wanted to shout out to our friend John, right, about solidarity with everyone and just everyone trying to work together to say, like, hey, this is wrong, and these are our stories, and these are stereotypes, and stereotypes are never helpful, even if they look positive. They do impact people in negative ways. And just being, for me individually, being myself, unapologetically being me, and despite of my background, and being proud of that, and sharing my heritage with people around me that might not understand my heritage, and then bringing that humanity into the conversation. And I've seen that, like, it opens up people's eyes, and they're like, yeah, like, Lynn's cool. And people in this background are, like, not only, like, submissive, smart, and so forth. They're funny. They have really great food. They're et cetera, like all of the descriptors of humanity.
Yeah, that's awesome and well said, Lynn. I've been reflecting on this as well, and just thinking about how, like, it seems like the personal interaction is what often creates the context for a shift of opinion and assumptions and whatnot. We all come into interactions with other people with preconceived notions of some sort, but when I can be intentional and targeted about talking about some of these things, that's where the needle starts to shift. I've seen that in some of my own conversations with friends, of different ethnicities, and being able to have these discussions, particularly around Asian American violence and whatnot, and being able to dig back a little bit and talk about some of those types of assumptions that are there already. I mean, in a lot of ways, my own background, I'm an engineer. I actually practice Kung Fu. There are a lot of things in which I would be like the model minority in a lot of ways. And at the same time, in my personal life, I've been trying to struggle against a lot of those assumptions. And a model minority kind of, similar to Will, I went to the Peace Corps as well, and trying to shift the discussion about who I am and realizing, just like you said, Will, like really, Annalyn, embracing who I am as an Asian American. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Do we want to open up the phone lines for any questions, if any come through on the phone lines?
Sure. Once again, I'd like to remind everybody by pressing #2, you can be placed into the question queue.
Thank you so much.
All right, we do have a question. Caller, go ahead.
Hey, good afternoon, Will, Lynn, and Sam. This is Ann Pupatown. I don't know if you can hear me okay or not. I see your smiles. I guess you can. Thank you so much for another excellent presentation. I really love this, and I'm so glad that so many of our allies are here with us to be a part of this community of change. One of the things I wanted to share about how we could change the model minority assumption is to challenge the positions that we get hired into, and then challenge the positions or the idea that we need to be in certain positions within the agency. As early as last week, I was speaking to a higher GS level colleague who observed that she felt like most Asian Americans only are in jobs that are tech related, if you will, statistics or DRM, computer GIS folks. And here I was, a hyper chatty biologist, who is in a soft science, if you will. And so that, to her, challenged that myth. And I tried to say, like, well, we all don't do statistics, we all don't do math. And so many of us could totally be public affairs officers and social media people and artists and so many other things that have nothing to do with hard science and hard math. So we need to continually challenge that and encourage people to hire all of our brothers and sisters, our diversity candidates out there for all these jobs that don't fit that stereotype, to show people that we have a huge breadth of skills and strengths that go beyond what people, generally people tend to think that we have. So I hope that as we continue to dialogue with our hiring managers, that we continue to say, look, you need to recruit at these other places. You need to stretch your comfort zone a little bit and take a chance on this person that you think may not do the job, but may do the job flawlessly and beautifully if you give them the opportunity. So I hope that we can change the way we hire people and stuff. So that's just what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ann. Operator, do we have any more folks who are on the line?
We do not.
Awesome.
Okay.
The
Well,
chat
we
I'm
have 5
also
minutes.
seeing. I'm sorry, go ahead. Folks in the chat hearing stuff or reading stuff about hiring, empowering, encouraging community. to rise in leadership positions so that we can lead by example and dispel the model minority myth. Awesome, awesome, awesome. And then some great comments on allyship. This is awesome. But Lynn, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much. I'll hand it over actually to Sam to talk about APA and what we are.
Yeah, so we're Employee Resource Group, Asian Pacific American Employee Association. If you're interested in joining us, whether you are of Asian heritage or not, you are welcome to. We have a link which I will put into the chat, and essentially just click on the link and put in the user name and password, and you can sign up. We have a lot of events going on this month, and I just wanted to say thank you for your participation. Will, are you going to be talking a little bit about some of the other events, or are we going to conclude here?
I am indeed. So a few other events that are coming up. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about Stop AAPI Hate. A lot of the discussion that was kind of teed up in this presentation is going to be talked about as well tomorrow. I will be posting a link to this in the chat. I definitely just closed my window, so hold with me while we get that in. Other webinars will all be on that on the Inside the Forest Service link. So please stay tuned for the remainder of this week, and next week as well we'll have a lot of programming. A special thank you to our two amazing presenters, both Lynn and Sam. Just to kind of embarrass them a little bit more, they've been working on this for months, and it shows. The work that they put into this, the presentation, the rehearsing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I told you all I wouldn't get excited on camera, but I'm definitely breaking that right now. But seriously, thank you for this presentation. Thank you for this learning opportunity. A huge also thank you to Patty Burrell and Hunt Spear, our folks who made sure that all of our tech ran smooth, to Rick Ballalong for supporting us in the beginning, as well as our AT&T operator. And then again, a huge shout out to Apaya. This month would not be possible without Apaya. The Employee Resource Group is really driving this month and making sure that we're producing high-quality programming. So truly, this month has come from the community at the ground level. A huge, huge thank you to Apaya. With that, Sam and Lynn, are there any other closing thoughts?
No, just thank you. Gamam, which means Vietnamese, thank you.
And Xie in Mandarin.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thanks a lot,
Till next
everybody.
time.
All right, thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today. Thank you for using Event Services. The call has now concluded. You may now disconnect.